Hello everyone, I'm Elfowls, and welcome to another match analysis for the Newport Noctowls in Season 10 of the Whooper Club League. Last time I talked about my Week 2 match, where I took a win against the Waterdeep Wobbuffets in a very close 1-0 differential. This time I'm up against Tony and the Mighty Miltanks. Those Miltanks are currently 0-2, but that doesn't make this team an easy team to prep for. They're actually one of the more offensive teams in the league, and they have a lot of threats that could mix my team up quite a bit. That team Tony drafted consists of Scyther, Zoroark, Articuno, Toxicroak, Tyrantrum, Flareon, Whiscash, Omastar, Wobbuffet, Copperaja, and Dusclops. Most of this team is offensively oriented. That said, there are a few Pokemon on Tony's side that I'm not that afraid of. First of all, Wobbuffet accomplishes basically nothing. It's not allowed to run Shadow Tag in our draft, so the best it can do is force a switch on one of my Pokemon that can't one-hit KO it. I think it has pretty poor use against most draft teams, but my team especially has some pretty great counters to it, with a special attacking Dark type and an Aroma Veil Pokemon to block Encore anyway. Flareon also isn't that great. It has more of a niche here, but I don't see it accomplishing much either. It only wins a few matchups, and it either loses or takes a lot of damage from anything faster than it, even in the matchups it wins. And lastly, Dusclops is an interesting Pokemon that can take a lot of hits, but I don't think it has much to do on this offensive team. It can maybe halt Raichu's momentum by surviving a hit, but it's not like it resists Rising Voltage anyway, so it doesn't take it all that well. And it just doesn't really have that much to do back to me. It doesn't respond with much that I feel threatened by. With those three out of the way, I'm going to move on to things that I'm actually concerned about. Tyrantrum is an absolute monster that I'll need a lot of prep for. Its scariest two options, I think, are a Dragon Dance set to set up once and start breaking, or maybe a Choice Band set that will just start breaking things immediately. Mudsdale is definitely my best answer. It seems like it's a good enough answer for it, but it's kind of prone to being worn down over the match, especially with the next threat we have to account for it, and it's going to be Zoroark, which is a very strong mixed attacker that can disguise itself as a different Pokemon and force out and KO specific checks that I'm bringing. Some scenarios running through my head include Mudsdale coming on in to check a Tyrantrum, only to be chunked down by a Dark Pulse and stay crippled for the rest of the match, not able to check Tyrantrum anymore after that. Or Raichu could set itself up to sweep against something that looks like an Articuno, only to get knocked out by a surprise Sucker Punch. Tony has a ton of options here to force 50-50s that I really just don't want to deal with that illusion. It's so annoying. And even looking past the ability, Zoroark is just a really strong, fast attacker that has really good coverage against my team. Even my best check to it in Aromatisse can potentially lose if Zoroark decides to run Sludge Bomb as coverage. So I definitely need to play afraid of this thing. And another Pokemon that complements Zoroark is that Toxicroak. Despite both of them being pretty frail, they actually make a good offensive core just through their combined coverage, and those defensive typings actually working fairly well together. Toxicroak's stabs are actually kind of tough for my team to deal with, so this is another attacker that could be putting a lot of pressure on Mudsdale as well. And moving right along, Scyther is another big physical threat that puts a lot of pressure on my defensive core. Luckily, both Mudsdale and Pincurchin are good defensive Pokemon that have good matchups here, but Scyther has a really good speed tier to deal with some of my offensive Pokemon, and it can always U-turn out to get good damage and keep itself safe from those defensive answers. It's definitely a valuable bring, I think. And to get into a defensive threat now, Whiscash is something that I think will also show up, mostly because it's Tony's only ground type. Without it, Raichu just kind of forces a KO every time it comes in with an electric move, and Whiscash does make a decent answer. Its stats aren't great, but they do the job to make it at least a one-time answer to Raichu or Pincurchin. Definitely something I'll have to account for. And in the most likely 6th slot that I have, Copperaja makes a lot of sense as Tony's Stealth Rocker, Steel type, and honestly just another huge way to put pressure on my physical walls with that massive attack stat. If it comes in at the right time, I might just have to pick a sack. It is just that strong and it has some great coverage for me. That actually leaves a few light considerations, for the first being Articuno, which I don't think is coming. It can be kind of passive and has a lot of weaknesses, but Tony has been favoring it a lot in his previous matches. It has usually been setting Hail manually and then Aurora Veil. It does take 2 turns, but it's bulky enough to do that, and doing that could make one of his setup sweepers a lot scarier. And in the final consideration here, Almastar is one last setup sweeper with Shell Smash that could be really scary, and it's also just a really strong water type as well. But I think Tony should already have a different water type locked in with Whiscash, which I am just so confident is coming. So I don't think it really makes that much sense to bring two of them against a team that isn't particularly weak to water. With this team, I think I am going to need to prepare some kind of defensive back mode, since positioning just with offensive Pokemon could really be a huge guessing game, and having some bulky Pokemon on my side could really ease that. That being said, I think Tony's team is kind of lacking some of that defense of its own, so I think I have a chance to set up my own offense and take the game that way as well. What resulted was a team that I would call very balanced, balance. To kick off the offensive side of that balance, Raichu is going to be my main offensive piece this week. We kind of murder everything under electric terrain, especially if we manage to find a nasty plot boost somewhere. Substitute also helps a lot with that, since I see multiple Sucker Punch users that I could use to safely set up a Substitute and then a nasty plot maybe. The coverage here is pretty basic. Rising Voltage kills everything except for Whiscash, which is kind of handled by Grass Knot. It actually takes it pretty well, since Whiscash for some reason is so light that Grass Knot only has 40 base power, so I might not take out some bulkier EV spreads, even with a nasty plot boost. We're going to need Whiscash chip down early before our sweep, as well as that Tyrantrum, which also resists electric. Speed is to outrun Toxicroak outside of the terrain, although of course we outrun everything in terrain, and we are running Magnet as our item to boost the power of Rising Voltage, without dealing with the chip damage from Life Orb on top of that damage we might also be doing to ourselves with Substitute. And Pincurchin is the obvious bring to support Raichu with a terrain extender to get as many turns as we can for our Raichu sweep. That's not our only way of supporting Raichu though, since we actually complement it pretty well by forcing in Whiscash early to take electric moves. If we can bait it in, we can Scald for chip and hopefully get that burn to stop any leftovers recovery, get that continuous chip onto Whiscash. Hopefully it trivializes that water ground type enough that Raichu can get an easy sweep later. For the other moves, Spikes is always great for more chip damage, that is so valuable here, and Recover is great to stay healthy and keep Pincurchin a good check to a few physical threats. We are physically defensive, and I think this set actually handles Scyther and Caparaja decently well, relieving some pressure off of my other physical wall, Mudsdale. Yep, Mudsdale is coming back with a very basic set this time. We are fully physically defensive with our usual coverage, Stealth Rock and Toxic. While the set's basic, how I play it is going to be much more important. I've tasked Mudsdale with handling Tyrantrum, most importantly, as well as being an emergency check to Scyther, Caparaja, Toxicroak, and Flareon, and that's on top of the fact that one of those might be a Zoroark in disguise. Mudsdale, as one Pokemon, obviously can't do all of that, so I'll need to play it carefully and hopefully save it as a check to Tyrantrum. To hopefully relieve more pressure off of Mudsdale, I'm bringing my Cleric this week with the debut of Aromatisse. Wish support is just so nice for Mudsdale specifically, and Aromatisse can be a really good check to Zoroark as well with full special defense investment and Moonblast to respond. For the last slot, I didn't feel like I needed the traditional heal bell in that Cleric role against a more offensive team, so Reflect felt like a better option to help fend off Tony's physical attackers. It either gives us more room to pivot around or more easily set up. Next up is Noivern, which I brought with the intention of being an offensive blanket check to a lot of Tony's team. We're running max HP to better tank a hit on switch in, and then we can use our speed to fire off a Draco Meteor to really chunk down anything that's causing problems. Flamethrower is nice coverage that lets us hit Caparaja, but it's also a more consistent hit on things like Scyther and Dryskin Toxicroak, so it's also a pretty spammable move. And as always, Defog is great utility, Roost is free healing if I force a switch anytime, and Frisk as the ability is just so useful for item scouting. And in the last slot, I'm actually really excited to be running Thievul, and despite being a dedicated terrain team this time with that extended electric terrain, I'm not running the Earned Burden set on Thievul. Instead, Choice Specs is what we're going to run with Stakeout, and it just seems to have such an amazing matchup against this Miltanks team. Dark Pulse, potentially doubled in power by the Stakeout boost, is very spammable with only Zoroark and Toxicroak resisting, and they definitely don't appreciate taking the hit regardless. Feeble's coverage is also pretty useful. Psychic ensures that we threaten out Toxicroak without relying on that stakeout to hit it on switch-in, and Burning Jealousy also hits Articuno a little harder, since Articuno actually, it's pretty specially defensive. It takes our hits pretty well, even on switch-in, to stakeout. Parting Shot is nice for momentum, and it's the move I click if I don't think Tony's going to switch out to activate that stakeout. We're much less powerful if he just stays in. Feeble isn't really a check to anything specific on Tony's team. He's just really here to punch a hole through something, so hopefully I can give him that opportunity and set up a Raichu sweep after that. With all of that said, I think it's just time to get into the battle. I will see you there. Well, look at that. Perfect predictions on the brings. I think this is actually the first time I've ever called out all 6 slots correctly, so that's pretty cool. But as I was looking at this matchup, it had also occurred to me that I had never really decided on a lead. As I thought it over, I thought Scyther was a possibility to scout with a fast U-turn, or maybe Caparajah to set rocks. And if that's the case, Mudsdale seems like a good pick to set up my own rocks, so let's try that. If the matchup seems bad, I can just switch out since I need to preserve Mudsdale's health for that Tyrantrum later. Good luck to Tony. And that is Whiscash. I'm really surprised to see it in the lead slot. I don't know what it's trying to do, but I need to take advantage of that. I know I just said I would switch Mudsdale out of bad matchups, but taking a water move is worth crippling this Whiscash early for a Raichu sweep later. I need to click Toxic. And oh, Dragon Dance. Got it. As I get that Toxic off, that does make a little more sense now. On one hand, that's great. I know there's no defensive ground type to answer my electric types anymore, especially now that the Whiscash is toxic as well. On the other hand, let's deal with this Whiscash right now. Noivern is going to be switching to handle both stab moves, so I am going to switch that in on the next turn. I actually frisk the Rocky Helmet, which is weird for a sweeper, and then Whiscash goes for another Dragon Dance. Okay, I might be a little scared now. On the next turn, after some toxic damage, we actually take a liquidation and take 36%. Poor Whiscash. That was really underwhelming damage. And so after that, I get to fire off that Draco Meteor, which Whiscash will barely survive after that toxic damage. And as much as I want to finally claim a KO this season with Noivern, Whiscash is going down to next turn to toxic anyway, so I'm just going to be smart and roost. But Whiscash reveals the Zen Headbutt and takes out the rest of Noivern's health. This really threw me off. I only realized later that the first liquidation had caused that defense drop that definitely allowed Whiscash to get enough damage to take me out. Shame on me for not noticing that, but honestly, Tony played that pretty well by waiting to reveal the Zen Headbutt until I was in range for it. That's a good call out. That Whiscash is going down to Toxic though, and with that, I am glad to have it out of the way early. Rising Voltage is looking really spammable later on in the match, as long as I get that chip onto maybe Tyrantrum and someone Caparajah probably in case it's running special defense investment. But right now, it's a double blind switch, so I am going to bring in Thievul, I think, to either fire off an attack or get a parting shot in. It should be safe to bring in against anything except for Scyther. Thievul comes in, and oh, look, Scyther. Not sure why I did that. Scyther, this is a free U-turn, and of course Tony was going to scout with it. That makes a lot of sense. So, as you can see, I do go for Pincurchin to take the hit, and getting the terrain set up is nice as well. And we are going to see the U-turn out into Caparajah. I'll note here that this is potentially the Zoroark since the Caparajah is in the last slot, and I did take some time on this turn to think about what was going on here. I don't want Pincurchin in against either Caparajah or Zoroark, so I need to switch out here, and I think that I am actually looking at a Caparajah right now. I think it would make more sense for it to come in, threaten Earthquake maybe, and set up rocks early in the game. Because of that, I am going to make just a bit of a risky play and switch the Mudsdale in, and I do take the Heavy Slam, probably meant for the Aromatisse, switching into a potential Zoroark. Very sneaky, I like the play there. But my defense is boosted now with that stamina, so I'm confident I beat this thing. So as it does make the switch out to Scyther to take the potential Earthquake, I'll just take the opportunity to get my rocks up. As for dealing with what's in front of me now, Tony did switch in Scyther on me to get that matchup, but this matchup is something I'm just fine with. Even if Scyther U-turns out again, I really have no problem staying in and hitting whatever switches in. So as we see what it does just go for a Swords Dance and then falls to a Rock Slide. No need to overpredict here. Mudsdale is just playing a really good matchup into my opponent's team right now. It's honestly doing so well, at full health still. On the Revenge is what looks like a Kaparaja, but that is neutral damage on the Stealth Rocks, so this is definitely a Zoroark we're looking at. I'm super glad that I have the rocks down now to be able to tell who the imposter is. With that, it's an easy switch into Aromatisse to take the Dark move, but I do get the Choice Scarf tricked onto me. That kind of sucks. But at least I can set something up before switching back out, and I think Reflect is going to be a good option to let me pivot around a little easier for the next few turns. As I go for that, the Zoroark is actually going to Sucker Punch, so it seems like it was explicitly being a sack to Moonblast, which is interesting. I think that was a little questionable, but you know, whatever. Now that Reflect is up, I think Thievul is actually going to be a great answer to Zoroark, so I'm going to switch in and take some light damage from a Throat Chop, which is interesting. Two different dark moves, physical, from this Zoroark. And then on the next turn, take even more damage from U-turn as Toxic Croak comes in. And on the switch, I do give it 73% from the Dark Pulse. This is exactly the play I was hoping to get with Thievul. And on the next turn, I am going to outspeed and take out the Toxic Croak without even knowing what it was supposed to do. Kaparaja is in on the Revenge, and that is the real Kaparaja based on the rocks damage it takes right there. So I'm going to make the safe switch into Mudsdale and take the superpower really well through the Reflect. Right here, this is going to be a free Earthquake. None of his team can take it anymore. So I am just going to click that on whatever he decides to do, and the Kaparaja number 2 switches in, and I break the illusion to bring Zoroark down to 1%. That's actually really unfortunate. I'd rather not take a potential special move from Zoroark. I don't know what that last move slot is, so I just don't want to risk it. I'm going to have to switch out here. And as I bring that in the Aromatisse, it would have just been a Sucker Punch, which I would have been happy to take with Mudsdale. That's too bad. The U-turn out here is going to be pretty obvious, and as he does that, I am just going to click Moonblast, but the Kaparaja is coming in. I maybe could have made a read here, but I'm not in a position where I need to overpredict or anything. Knowing that Mudsdale is safe in the back for that Tyrantrum later, I'm going to bring in Pincurchin here. And we set up terrain for that Raichu, which is great, and we take the Power Whip. That's a good call against the team with Mudsdale, but luckily I didn't switch in on that with Mudsdale right there. But anyway, this is kind of looking like a Pincurchin sack to get Raichu in safely. On the next turn, I actually don't go down as Kaparaja goes for Heavy Slam, so maybe no Earthquake on that. Nice for me. And that does let me go for the Rising Voltage to chunk it down, and then on the next turn, I will just continue that sack, go down. And now I can bring in Raichu, with 5 turns left of terrain with that Terrain Extender, and 3 Pokemon left to take out. Looking at what's left, I probably don't one-hit KO the Tyrantrum, which hasn't taken any damage yet. So setting up is tempting here, but I'm expecting this Kaparaja to just attack me until it goes down, so I have to attack to preserve my own health. That actually doesn't happen though, as the Zoroark comes in as a sack. So I do take it out with the Rising Voltage. Maybe that could have been a substitute and then a nasty plot to kind of set up while keeping myself safe. But maybe not, I don't know. I wouldn't have really cared to play Sucker Punch mind games, trying to set up twice against the Zoroark, so I am just glad it's down now. I took a Pokemon out, happy with that. Tyrantrum is in next, and I'm not exactly prepared to take it down yet, since I don't think Rising Voltage will do a ton of enough damage to KO yet, but it will still do a ton, and the Tyrantrum doesn't really have options here. It can either take me out after taking the big hit with Rising Voltage and then go down to probably Mudsdale on the next turn, or it can try to set up against a Raichu in Electric Terrain and still be outsped the next turn. So, let's see what it decides to do, as Rising Voltage does a whopping 81% on a resist, Tyranium does go with that latter option, and that essentially seals the game. One more outspeed and rising voltage on the Tyrantrum will take it down, and then one more final rising voltage click against the Copper Raja will allow me to take the game 4-0. That was a pretty good match. Maybe a few mistakes he made here and there, but I'm really happy with the results. Going back over the big plays, I do stand by my decision to staying with Mudsdale on Whiscash in the lead slot. That Toxic ended up being incredibly valuable in taking out the Whiscash, which was surprisingly offensively good. Even though it costed Noivern, we did take it out early enough without too much trouble, and most importantly, no damage onto Mudsdale. Speaking of Noivern, despite the 0-3 kill-death ratio, I am happy with how useful it's been as a scout and offensive check to certain threats. It looks like I did need it to contain that Whiscash to only 1 KO, so good job to Noivern. I do wish I could use it a little more than what happened to it this match, but we'll see what happens in the future weeks. Later on, I do think that Mudsdale could have gone for a full sweep later in the match, but I was just too scared of a special Zoroark attack to make that play, and that did cost Pincurchin in the next few turns after that. But that's fine. It did open up a Raichu sweep in Electric Terrain, and after 3 weeks into the season, I'm really glad I was able to make that happen. I think Mudsdale and Raichu were definitely the stars of this performance, but I really liked the whole team this time around. Every team member contributed in some significant way, and we do love to see that. We are headed strong into Week 4, and hopefully we can keep up that momentum when we fight Chad and the Seattle Steamrollers. This is going to be a tough matchup, so join me next time to see how we build around Chad's very threatening team. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.